They say architecture is the art of how to waste space, but at 17, my life felt like it had no space at all. I was a British-American anomaly walking the cobblestones of Oxford, younger than my peers, sharper than I should have been, and carrying a heavy load of expectations that weren't even mine. I didn't come to Oxford to be a face on a billboard. I came to design cities. I came to understand why some structures stand for 1,000 years while others crumble under their own weight. I lived in the Radcliffe camera, or so it felt. The scent of old paper and beeswax was my sanctuary until the afternoon the trajectory of my life shifted. I was deep in a heated, whispered argument with a structural engineering professor near the back stacks. I was insisting that his load distribution calculations for a Gothic arch were missing a fundamental variable. I was passionate, probably a little too loud for a library, and entirely convinced I was right. Then I saw the error. A simple decimal point misplaced in my own notes. I didn't shrink, I didn't blush. I just looked at the professor, looked at the paper, and let out a genuine, self-deprecating laugh that echoed off the domed ceiling. "Well," I whispered, "I suppose the building just collapsed. My apologies, Professor." "The building might have collapsed," a voice intervened from the next table, but that laugh just saved the afternoon. I turned to see Julian. He was 24, an American postgraduate with shoulders that seemed too broad for the narrow library desks and eyes that looked like they'd seen more of the world than I'd even read about. He wasn't looking at my face, the face that photographers would later call once in a generation. He was looking at my notes. "You were wrong about the load," he said, sliding a pen toward me, "but you were right about the intent. Most people would rather be right and boring than wrong and interesting. You're definitely not boring." That was the library law. For the next 6 months, Julian became the fixed point in my orbit. We became a study in proximity. We spent hundreds of hours in those stacks, our hands occasionally brushing as we reached for the same reference book. We took late-night walks where the damp Oxford air felt charged with something more potent than academia. I would go back to my room and replay every sentence, every debate, every time he challenged my logic, trying to build a blueprint of whatever this was between us. He was the elite character in my world, brilliant, headed for a massive career in New York, and somehow, he was choosing to spend his Friday nights explaining fluid dynamics to a 17-year-old girl who liked to argue. It happened on the bridge. The fog was rolling in off the water, blurring the edges of the spires. Julian stopped, leaning his back against the stone railing. He looked at me for a long time, the kind of look that makes you feel like the only person left on the planet. "I've spent 2 degrees and lived in 2 different countries," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steady vibration. "And in all that time, Alina, you are the most interesting person I've ever encountered." My heart did something structural. It shifted its entire foundation. Before he could finish the sentence, before he could give me a reason to be afraid, I reached out and kissed him. The 2 years that followed that first kiss on the bridge felt like a masterclass in stability. In architecture, a load-bearing wall is the one that holds the roof up. Without it, the whole structure collapses. For me, Julian became that wall. We navigated the transition from my late teens into my early 20s with a synchronization that felt almost eerie. While my classmates were navigating messy breakups and transient flings, Julian and I were building something that felt, as he often put it, engineered to last. Our dates weren't just dinners, they were blueprints for a future. We spent weekends tucked into corner booths of dim pubs, sketching the layout of a hypothetical apartment in Manhattan. He'd argue for industrial loft windows. I'd insist on a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves. We were young, brilliant, and arguably arrogant enough to believe we could dictate exactly how our lives would unfold. But the reality of our age gap eventually caught up with the calendar. Julian graduated with his Master in engineering, and the world, specifically a prestigious consultancy firm in New York, came calling. The final month in Oxford was a blur of packing crates and desperate proximity. We tried to cram a lifetime of touch into 30 days. I remember sitting on his suitcase to help him zip it shut, the silence between us heavy with the unspoken fear of 3,000 miles of ocean. I was still finishing my degree, my own career as a model beginning to simmer in the background, though I still viewed it as a side hustle to fund my architectural dreams. "It's just a gap, Alina," he told me one rainy Tuesday, his hands cupping my face. "A temporary structural gap. We've calculated the stress loads. We know the math. We can handle the distance." "Math doesn't feel lonely at 3:00 a.m., Julian," I countered, though I leaned into his touch. The day of his departure felt like a demolition. The Heathrow departure gate was a sea of gray suits and rolling luggage, but Julian stood out like a monument. He looked every bit the high-stakes professional he was becoming, expensive overcoat, sharp jawline, and a focused intensity that usually intimidated people. But when he looked at me, that intensity softened into something almost fragile. He pulled a small, heavy object from his pocket and pressed it into my palm. It was a brass plumb bob, the weight architects use to ensure a line is perfectly vertical. "Keep this," he whispered, "to remind you that no matter how far I go, our center of gravity is exactly where you are." I held onto that piece of brass like a talisman. We made promises across that security barrier that felt like architecture, permanent, heavy, and designed to withstand the elements. We didn't say goodbye, we said see you at the site. 18 months, he promised, his voice steady even as mine wavered. "You finish your degree, I get the New York office ready for you, and then we start the real build. No more letters, no more screens." I watched him walk away until his broad shoulders disappeared into the crowd. I stood there for a long time, the cold brass weight in my hand the only thing keeping me grounded. I didn't know then that 18 months was long enough for a foundation to crack. I didn't know that New York wasn't just a destination. It was the place where everything we had built was about to be tested against a sensory reality I wasn't prepared for. As the plane took off, I felt the first tremor. "New York isn't a destination," I whispered to the empty air, repeating his words like a prayer. "It's our foundation." New York City doesn't just greet you, it challenges you. 18 months after that heavy silence at the Heathrow departure gate, I stepped out of JFK and into a humidity that smelled of asphalt and ambition. This was supposed to be the victory lap. I had finished my degree with honors, and my side hustle in modeling had exploded into a legitimate career. I was in town for my first major international fashion show, a career-defining milestone that would finally place me in the same city as Julian. I texted him from the tarmac, my thumbs shaking. "Just landed. I'm finally here. Can't wait to see you tonight." I stared at the screen until the delivered icon appeared. No response. I told myself it was the morning rush, a high-stakes board meeting, or the dead zones of the Midtown elevators. I checked into my hotel, the view of the Chrysler building mocking my growing unease. I texted again from the marble lobby, heading to the venue for a fitting. "Call me when you can." Still, the silence was absolute. It felt like a structural failure I couldn't quite locate. The next morning, the city was a blur of black coffee and frantic assistants. My car was idling outside a midtown restaurant, trapped in the gridlock of a delivery truck. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the sea of suits on the sidewalk. And then, the world stopped moving. There he was. Julian was standing outside a bistro, looking exactly like the man I had memorized for nearly 2 years, yet entirely like a stranger. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, but he wasn't alone. Standing inches from him was a woman in her early 20s. She was stunning in a way that felt effortless, her laughter ringing out even through the glass of my car window. She was looking at him with the ease of someone who didn't just know his jokes, but lived within them. Then came the physical reality that broke the blueprint. Julian reached out. His hand settled on her shoulder, a brief, familiar gesture that felt like an intimate shorthand. The woman didn't flinch. She leaned into it, her fingers reaching up to adjust the lapel of his jacket, straightening his collar with a proprietary touch that only comes from shared mornings. I watched this for exactly 4 seconds. In architecture, they teach you that a building doesn't collapse all at once. It happens in the moments the tension exceeds the strength of the material. In those 4 seconds, the tension of 18 months of waiting snapped. I didn't see a colleague. I didn't see an assistant. I saw a man who had built a new life in the space I was supposed to occupy. My phone buzzed in my hand. It wasn't him. It was a notification for a calendar invite. "Ma'am, the light's green," the driver said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I looked at Julian one last time. He was smiling at her, the same smile he'd given me on the Oxford Bridge. The pretense versus reality flip was complete. The letters, the promises, the brass plumb bob in my purse, it was all a lie built on a hollow foundation. "Don't stop," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Keep driving." "To the restaurant." "No," I whispered, clutching my bag until my knuckles turned white. "To the venue. I have a show to do." I did not call his name. I did not cross the street to demand an explanation. I made a choice that would cost me the next 8 months of my life. I would not be the girl who crossed an ocean only to end up as the second-choice shadow in his new New York light. The fashion show was a blur of strobe lights and synthetic fabrics, a hollow triumph that the industry hailed as my arrival. To the cameras, I looked like a queen claiming her throne. Inside, I was a demolition site. Every flash of a lens felt like a physical strike. I walked the runway with a cold, mechanical precision, my mind trapped in a 4-second loop of a hand on a shoulder and a hand on a collar. As soon as the final walk ended, I retreated to the dressing room and did what I should have done months ago. I looked at the 3,000 miles of distance between who I was in Oxford and who I had become in New York. I realized that a building with a cracked foundation cannot be repaired. It has to be cleared. I didn't call Julian. I didn't send a scathing text. Instead, I turned my phone off, removed the SIM card, and dropped it into a trash can outside the venue. It was a clean break, the kind of silence that leaves no room for negotiation. By the time I landed back in London 48 hours later, I had already begun the process of the forbidden proximity. If I couldn't have him, I would ensure I was never near him again. I met with my agency the following morning. The air in the office was celebratory. My New York debut had tripled my booking rate, but I cut the champagne short. "I'm moving my base of operations permanently," I told my agent, Sarah. "But I have one non-negotiable condition." Sarah paused, a pen halfway to a contract. "Anything, Alina. You're the face of the season." "No New York," I said, the words feeling like iron. "No shoots in the city, no runway shows at Lincoln Center, no editorial work that requires a layover in Newark. If the client is in Manhattan, the answer is no." Sarah stared at me as if I'd just suggested we set the building on fire. "Alina, you're an architect turned model. New York is the capital of both your worlds. You're turning down millions." "Then I'll make millions elsewhere," I replied. The next 8 months were a masterclass in living around a void. I built a life that looked perfect from the outside, Paris, Milan, Tokyo, but it was a life defined by the shape of Julian's absence. I moved into a new flat, changed my number to an unlisted line, and blocked every mutual acquaintance we had ever shared. I treated my memory of him like a structural hazard, something to be boarded up and forgotten. I told myself I was moving on. I told myself that the silence was my power. But every time I saw a brass plumb bob in a shop window or heard an American accent in a crowded cafe, the self-protective ego I had built would tremble. The breaking point came when Sarah walked into my studio with a look of frantic desperation. She dropped a heavy, glossy folder on my desk. The Vogue logo shimmered in the light. "It's the American Vogue cover, Alina. The September issue, it's the holy grail," she whispered. "They want you, only you." I didn't even open the folder. I knew where they shot the September cover. I knew what skyline would be in the background. "No," I said, my voice flat. "I told you, I don't go to New York." "Alina, listen to me," Sarah pleaded. "You are letting a ghost run your career. Whatever happened there, you are bigger than it. Don't let your fear break the version of yourself that deserves this." I looked out the window at the gray London sky, clutching the secret of my own devastation. I wasn't just afraid of the city. I was afraid that if I went back, I'd find out that the 8 months of silence hadn't hurt him at all. "The answer is no," I repeated, "and that's final." While I was busy building walls in London, 3,000 miles away, Julian Hayes was living in a masterpiece of his own design, one that felt more like a prison every day. To the world, he was the rising star of Manhattan's engineering elite, a man who could calculate the wind resistance of a skyscraper, but couldn't solve the equation of a girl who had vanished into thin air. For 8 months, Julian had existed in a state of extreme stakes secrecy. He hadn't told his partners why his eyes were always on his phone during board meetings, or why he stayed late at the office staring at a deactivated contact in his WhatsApp. He had seen me. That morning 8 months ago, he had caught a flash of my profile in a passing car. He had felt the air change, a physical pull that told him I was there. But by the time he had reached the curb, the car was a ghost in the traffic. And then I had disappeared. My British number was disconnected. My social media went dark. It was as if I had been a structural error he dreamt up. "He's doing it again," a voice said, breaking through the silence of his office. Julian looked up. Standing in the doorway was Maya, the woman I had seen in Midtown. In reality, Maya wasn't a rival. She was the most efficient executive assistant in the tri-state area and the only person who knew Julian was a man operating on a broken engine. "The 10:00 a.m. briefing started 5 minutes ago, Julian," Maya said, her tone a mix of professional reprimand and genuine concern. She walked over and set a tablet on his desk. "And stop looking at the London weather report. It won't bring her back." "I saw her, Maya," Julian whispered, his voice sandpaper dry. "That day outside the bistro, I know it was her. And then I went to the hotel she usually stays at, and they said she checked out early. Why would she just leave?" Maya sighed, leaning against the mahogany desk. She was the one who had spent the last 8 months watching her boss crumble. She was the one who had straightened his collar that morning, because he had been too distracted by the thought of my arrival to notice his own reflection. "Maybe she saw what she wanted to see, and not what was actually there," Maya said quietly. Julian frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you're an engineer, Julian. You look at the blueprints, but women, we look at the shadows the building casts." Maya picked up the tablet. "I did some digging. I found her agency, and I found her Instagram, the professional one. She's been working in Paris and Milan, but she's blacklisted New York entirely." Julian stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. She's avoiding me. Or she's protecting herself, Maya countered. But I think it's time we stop waiting for her to come to us. Unknown to Julian, Maya had already been in contact with Sarah, my agent in London. They were two women on opposite sides of the Atlantic, playing a high-stakes game of the trope subversion. They knew that if they waited for us to resolve our pride, we'd both be 80 and alone. I have an idea, Maya said, a small, calculating smile playing on her lips. Vogue wants her for the September cover. She said no because it's in New York. But what if we offer them something they can't refuse? What if the location isn't just a studio? What if it's the most exclusive rooftop in the city? This rooftop, Julian. Julian looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city. You want to trap her. I want to give her a reason to look at the blueprint again, Maya replied. I've already sent the proposal to her agent. Now, you just need to stay out of sight until I tell you the door is locked. The negotiation lasted 3 weeks. A delicate dance of deception played out over encrypted emails and international calls. In London, I was unaware that my own fortress was being dismantled from the inside. Sarah, my agent, was a master of the pretense versus reality flip. She knew that if she mentioned the specific building, I would bolt. Instead, she sold me a compromise that felt like a victory. They've moved the shoot, Alina, she told me, her voice casual as she leaned against my studio desk. American Vogue is willing to do a one-day in-and-out session. No hotel stay. You fly in at dawn, shoot on a private rooftop away from the Midtown madness, and fly back to Heathrow before midnight. They've even agreed to a closed set. No press, no public. I looked at the contract. It was a masterpiece of vague terminology. The location was listed only as Site 50, Private Engineering Plaza. One day, I asked, my finger tracing the edge of the brass plumb bob I still kept on my desk. Less than 12 hours on U.S. soil, Sarah promised. You don't even have to leave the transport vehicle until you're inside the service elevator. You won't see a single soul you don't want to see. I felt the familiar tug-of-war in my chest. 8 months of avoidance had turned New York into a mythical monster, but the architect in me was starving. To shoot the September cover on a skyline rooftop was a career pinnacle I couldn't ignore. I told myself I was strong enough now. I told myself that the forbidden proximity no longer had power over me because I had outgrown the girl who cried in the back of a town car. Fine, I said. One day, tell them I'm coming. The flight across the Atlantic felt like traveling through a pressurized tunnel. I didn't sleep. I watched the sunrise over the clouds and tried to steady my breathing. I was dressed in my armor, a sharp, oversized blazer and dark sunglasses. I was a professional. I was a model. I was an architect of my own identity. The car was waiting at JFK, just as Sarah had promised. The windows were tinted black, erasing the city as we sped toward Midtown. I kept my eyes on my lap, refusing to look at the streets that held the ghosts of my past. We're here, Miss James, the driver said as we pulled into a sterile, underground parking garage. I was whisked into a freight elevator by a frantic production assistant. The ascent was silent, the numbers on the digital display climbing higher and higher, 30, 40, 50. My ears popped with the pressure. When the doors opened, I was greeted by the controlled chaos of a Vogue set, racks of silk, camera lenses the size of telescopes, and a hair and makeup team that descended on me before I could even take a breath. I didn't look at the building. I didn't look at the logos on the glass doors. I allowed myself to be painted and dressed in a gown of structured silver that felt like liquid metal. You look like a god, Alina, the photographer whispered as he led me toward the rooftop access door. Now I need you to go out there. The light is perfect. Just look at the city like you own it. I pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped onto the roof. The wind caught my hair, and for the first time in 8 months, I looked up. My heart stopped. The vantage point was hauntingly familiar. I looked down at the street level, realizing I was standing directly above the bistro where I had seen him. This wasn't just any building. This was Julian's firm. This was the site of the collapse. At that exact moment, the rooftop access door on the far side of the mechanical shed creaked open. The rooftop was an island of concrete and glass suspended in the clouds. The wind at this altitude was fierce, whipping my silver gown around my legs like a living thing, but I didn't feel the cold. I was paralyzed. The realization of where I was, standing atop the very monument of Julian's success, felt like a structural failure of my own making. I had walked right into the heart of the wound. I turned away from the edge, my breath coming in shallow hitches, and that's when the moment struck. The heavy steel door on the opposite side of the roof swung open. I expected a lighting technician or an assistant with a coat. Instead, a man stepped out into the light. He was looking down at a tablet in his hand, his brow furrowed in that specific way it always did when he was solving a problem he couldn't quite master. It was Julian. He was dressed for the office, white shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, no tie. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the powerful lead energy he carried had only intensified. He took 3 steps onto the gravel before he sensed another presence. Julian looked up. And then he froze. The tablet slipped from his hand, hitting the roof with a dull thud that seemed to echo louder than the sirens of the city below. The visual recognition was instantaneous. He didn't see a world-famous model in a couture dress. He saw the girl from the Oxford Library. He saw the girl who had vanished. Elena. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the roar of the New York wind. I couldn't move. I was a statue of silver and regret. This was the forbidden proximity incident I had spent 8 months and thousands of dollars to avoid. Every defense I had built, the new phone number, the city blacklists, the cold professionalism, crumbled in the span of a heartbeat. Behind the camera, the photographer started to bark orders, but his voice sounded like it was underwater. "Don't move, Elena. That expression. That's the shot, the shock, the recognition. Keep it." But I wasn't posing. I was drowning. Julian started toward me, his movements tentative, as if he were afraid I was a hallucination that would dissolve if he moved too fast. He stopped 10 feet away, the space between us charged with the electricity of 8 months of silence. "You're here," he said, his eyes searching mine with a desperation that made my throat ache. "I've looked for you in every crowd in this city. I've called a number that doesn't exist 1,000 times. I thought I'd lost the blueprint for good." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him who that woman was and why her hand had been on his shoulder. But looking at him now, against the backdrop of the city that had almost broken us, the words wouldn't come. "I saw you, Julian," I finally managed to choke out. 8 months ago, I was here, I saw everything." Julian stopped dead. The color drained from his face as he realized the exact moment the bridge had collapsed. "That day at the restaurant," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You saw me." The photographer's shutter clicked rapidly, capturing the raw, jagged edges of a reunion that wasn't supposed to happen. The tension on that roof was no longer about a magazine cover. It was about 2 people standing on the edge of a truth that could either rebuild them or finish the demolition for good. The wind on the roof seemed to die down, leaving us in a vacuum of silence that felt heavier than the noise of the city. Julian stood 10 feet away, his expression a haunting mixture of relief and absolute horror. The pretense versus reality flip was happening in real time. The man I had cast as a villain in my head for 8 months looked like he was the one who had been haunted. "You saw me," he repeated, his voice cracking. "And you left. Alina, why didn't you just call my name? Why didn't you cross the street?" I felt a surge of the old fire, the girl who used to argue with professors in the Oxford stacks. "And say what, Julian? Excuse me, I'm the girl from the letters, the one who just flew across the ocean. Am I interrupting?" "I saw her hand on you. I saw the way she fixed your collar. I saw the way you looked at her. I didn't need a blueprint to see that the space I was moving into was already occupied." Julian took a step forward, his hands out as if trying to steady a collapsing structure. "Occupied? Alina, that was Maya, my assistant, my friend. We had a presentation for the city council in 40 minutes that was going to determine the next 3 years of my career. I was a nervous wreck because I knew you were landing. I was checking my watch every 30 seconds. She was literally holding me together so I wouldn't walk into a boardroom looking like a man who'd lost his mind." I looked away, the silver fabric of my dress shimmering like a cold metallic tear. "She touched you like she owned the right to." "She touched me like a sister who knew I was about to spiral," Julian countered, his voice dropping into that low, steady frequency, the words of connection. "I spent 8 months checking that restaurant every single day at the same time, hoping for a miracle. I spent 8 months wondering if our foundation was so weak that you could see a shadow and think the whole building was on fire." He stepped closer, into my personal space, ignoring the photographer who was now hovering like a ghost. "I didn't lose you because I moved on, Alina," he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine with a devastating clarity. "I lost you because you loved me too much to risk being wrong about losing me. You built a wall to protect yourself, but all you did was lock me out of the one thing I was working to build for us." I felt the air leave my lungs. It was the truth I had been hiding from myself. My silence hadn't been a sign of strength. It had been a symptom of fear. I had been so afraid of being second that I had opted to be nothing. I started, my voice small. I thought I was being the architect. I thought I was clearing the site. "You were clearing the site," Julian said, his hand finally reaching out, hovering just inches from my arm. "But you forgot that I'm the engineer. I don't give up on a project just because there's a tremor. I wait for the dust to settle, and then I find a way to make it stronger." The words of connection hung in the air between us. For the first time in 8 months, the silence didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like an invitation to start again. The world outside our 10-foot radius began to bleed back in, but it felt secondary, a background noise to the seismic shift happening between us. The photographer, a man known for his ruthlessness, hadn't stopped clicking. He knew he was witnessing something far more valuable than a fashion editorial. He was capturing the forbidden proximity collapsing into a trope subversion. "Julian," I whispered, the name feeling like a long-lost key in a lock. "I've spent 8 months hating this city because I thought it took you away from me. I didn't realize I was the one who walked away." Julian didn't wait for the production crew to clear out. He didn't care about the silver couture gown that cost more than a mid-sized car. He crossed the final few feet of gravel and reached out. His hand, warm and solid, finally touched my face, the first physical contact in nearly 2 years. The sensation was a physical shock. It was the sensory reality that decimated 8 months of lies. "I'm not going to let you fly back to London tonight, Alina," he said, his voice thick with a resolve that brooked no argument. "I don't care about the contracts. I don't care about the one-day compromise. We are going to sit down, and we are going to look at every crack in this foundation until we know how to fix it." Behind us, the photographer lowered his camera. "That's it. "We're done. We'll never get anything better than that." He was right. The image he had just captured wasn't of a model posing on a roof. It was a shot of two people in the middle of a private hurricane. My head was tilted back, Julian's hand was on my cheek, and the entire skyline of New York, the city that had almost broken us, was blurred into a soft, glowing bouquet behind us. It was a picture of a surrender. As the crew began to break down the equipment, the public reunion became the talk of the set. The assistants whispered, and the stylist watched with wide eyes. They had expected a cold, professional shoot. They had witnessed a resurrection. Maya stepped onto the roof then, holding a coat. She didn't look like a rival anymore. She looked like the woman who had spent 8 months watching a man break and had finally decided to play God to put him back together. She caught my eye and gave a small, knowing nod. "The car for the airport is waiting downstairs," Maya announced loudly, then paused, looking directly at me. "But I suspect you won't be needing it." Julian didn't look at her. He didn't look at the crew. He just looked at me, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "Stay," he whispered. "The blueprints are still in the drawer. We just need to start the build." The fear that had governed my life since that day in Midtown didn't disappear, but it shifted. It went from a load-bearing wall to a pile of rubble. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that rubble is just the first step of a new construction. The elevator ride down from the 50th floor was a silent transition between worlds. When we stepped into the lobby, the sharp, sterile air of the corporate plaza met us, but Julian didn't let go of my hand. The silver gown I wore trailed behind me, an shimmering anomaly against the marble floor, but I didn't feel out of place. For the first time in 8 months, I felt perfectly centered. Maya was waiting by the glass doors. As we approached, she handed me a simple trench coat to cover the couture. "The airport car has been dismissed," she said, her professional mask finally slipping into a warm, tired smile. "I took the liberty of sending your luggage to Julian's place. I figured if I was going to play architect with your lives, I might as well finish the job." Julian stopped in front of her. "You've been fired 3 times today in my head, Maya," he said softly, "but I suppose I'll have to give you a promotion instead." "Just give her a vacation," I added, looking at the woman I had once feared. "She's earned it." Justice, I realized, wasn't about a grand apology or a public shaming. It was the quiet transformation of my own perspective. I had spent nearly a year viewing Maya as the person who stole my life, when in reality, she was the only one who had been holding the blueprints together while I was busy trying to burn the site down. We walked out into the New York evening. The city didn't feel like a monster anymore. It felt like a challenge. We ended up at a small, quiet park overlooking the East River, the water reflecting the thousands of lights from the bridges. "I have something," Julian said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, worn piece of brass. It was the plumb bob I had left behind in his apartment 2 years ago, the one I thought I'd lost. "I found this under the radiator when I moved into the new place. I've kept it on my desk every day since. It was the only thing that stayed vertical when everything else felt like it was leaning." I took it from him, the metal still holding the warmth of his hand. "I'm sorry I didn't trust the math, Julian. I'm sorry I ran from the shadows." "The math is easy," he whispered, pulling me into the space where the wall used to be. "It's the faith that's hard, but we have time now, a lifetime of it." The emotional resolution felt earned, not because the misunderstanding was cleared, but because we both admitted we were capable of breaking. We stayed there for a long time, watching the city breathe, 2 architects finally ready to build something that wasn't just beautiful, but load-bearing. But as we walked away toward the lights of the city, one lingering question drifted through my mind. a soft ache that the reunion couldn't quite heal. If Maya hadn't intervened, if she hadn't forced our hands, how many more years would we have spent living as ghosts in each other's lives? And as I looked at the brass weight in my palm, I noticed a small, unfamiliar engraving on the bottom that I hadn't seen back in Oxford. A set of coordinates I didn't recognize, dated for 3 years from today. Julian saw me looking at it and gently closed my hand over the metal. "Some blueprints," he whispered with a cryptic smile, "aren't meant to be read all at once." I smiled back, but as we headed into the night, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets were hidden in the foundations we had yet to lay.